They called it the Crucible, and they meant it literally. A ringed habitat the size of a city, hermetically sealed, with tiers of simulated climates, wind-swept tundras, blistering deserts, synthetic jungles, and rooms that simply withheld calories until the bodies in them learned to be efficient enough to survive. It was the ultimate behavioral testing consortium of worlds used to judge which species were adaptable enough to be given terraforming contracts and trade privileges. The consensus among the visiting xenobiologists was simple and smug. This was a starvation simulation. Food would be hidden or rationed. The species that endured the longest kept their data, and learned to cooperate would earn their place. Most entrants went in with lists, hunting tactics, ration schedules, metabolic suppression protocols. Humans had come not as a polity, but as a curiosity. 100 volunteers from various Earth cultures, small in number compared to delegations of the megafaunal cress, the hive belu, or the engineered endurance lines of the gar. They had quirkier names: a fishing teacher from Kerala, a retired astrophysicist from Chile, a barista from Toronto, a medic from Lagos. They were laughed at in the forums. The crest captain called them decorative primates during an official tea. The simulation began. The gates sealed. Rations were cut to near starvation levels. The ring's controls went feral. Storms where ships expected calm, microbial blooms that consumed predictable crops, and faux predators. The advanced species quickly enacted their plans. The belu built digestion vats. The guard disciplined their regiments, entering metabolic hibernations in unison. And then they failed. The belu vats coagulated and suffocated their young. The guard miscalculated hibernation cycles and woke with tremors of psychosis. The cress, who could get a seal at depth, could not make prey from the simulation's artificial biomass. Cooperation faltered when leadership argued about commandeering reserves. Every assumption was exploited by the Crucible's design. The human group's advantage began small, unplanned. On day 12, with caches empty and morale ash, Mara, the fishing teacher, found a patch of strange berries beneath a metallic shrub that most species called ornamental. She tasted one, then another, then gathered a handful and handed them to Lien the medic. Neither died. Word spread. Where other species saw oddity, humans saw a possibility. They tasted, tested, and labeled. Within 48 hours, the humans had a catalog of edible flora, fungal nets that could be fermented, and insect larvae that, when roasted, lost their bitterness and gained something like umami. They did not hoard the information. Mara taught the rest to forage. Lien improvised sanitation with sea salt and centrifuge stormwater. The barista taught people to extract oils and bloom flavors. But there was a second, quieter skill at work. The humans cooked. Cooking, the volunteers explained in gestures and broken trade speak, was not just about turning raw into edible. It was a way to transform scarcity into abundance of morale. They roasted larval grubs with a pinch of pulverized seed. They made berry compote sweetened with resin sap. They turned a bitter fungus into a rich tang with smoke and salt. They taught others how to coax flavor and nutrition from the same small inputs. For species with no cultural concept of comfort food, this was a revelation. At first, the other delegations watched like scholars at a theater. But hunger rewires priorities. The belu, whose digestive commons had failed, were the first to come. The cress, suspicious and proud, came later and awkwardly accepted roasted tubers. Even the gar, whose order bordered on religion, took a bowl of stew because the steam was warm and the scent was oddly familiar. That was the second human weapon, pedagogy, teaching, not decrees but small, replicable acts. The humans didn't just hand out food. They showed others how to make it. They mounted impromptu classes, Mara on a crate, voice hoarse but precise, demonstrating a peel and boil technique that released carbohydrates from fibrous roots. Lien demonstrated wound cleaning with herb poultices that cut infection rates. The barista taught a simple roasting rhythm that produced consistent results. Within a week, the simulation metrics changed. Mortality curves flattened. Desperation-driven violence, the kind that had marred earlier failures, declined. The Crucible's designers had meant to reward raw endurance and resource control, but the human approach exploited a loophole. When you can turn small things into many useful things and show someone else how to do it, you multiply survival. The turning point came during a brutal, simulated winter. The resources still felt rigged. Storm-stripped shelters, ice-crystallized equipment. A corner of the habitat had a public kitchen the designers left as a joke. Benches and a hearth that spat only smoke. For 3 days, no one used it. On day 30, the humans arranged a cooking circle and invited everyone. The Belu sent protein vats. The crest brought salt and dried fish. The Gar offered preserved roots. The circle was awkward, layered with species pride. Mara started a fire with a lens. Lien lit fragrant herbs. They mixed, tasted, and adjusted. The stew that came out was a mosaic. Sea foam from the Belu, charred tuber from human hands, softened Gar roots. They called it the treaty stew, half joke, half protocol. Eating it did more than fill bellies. It set a social contract. At that table, species exchanged survival tricks, laughed at absurd mistakes, and learned to trade foraging zones instead of stealing them. They set rota systems for common kitchens and a language of temperature and texture that both Belu and Gar could appreciate. The Crucible, which had been designed to measure hoarding and dominance, faltered before this new metric. Monitors flagged the rise in cooperative efficiency. The designers patched, increasing predatory events and sending scarcity pulses. But the human networks of knowledge were a social immune system. They adapted faster than the algorithms could recalibrate. One telling scene came late in the trial. A young Belu hatchling had fallen into a tub of fermenting berry juice and was drowning. The Belu elders hesitated. A human named Amina used a buoyant bundle of dried moss to support the hatchling. The Belu, alarmed and grateful, learned how to bind a splint from woven grass. When the gates opened and the data were tabulated, the verdict stunned the council. The humans, predicted to rank near the bottom, had the most robust survival index, not due to strength or single tech, but because they had taught. Their ability to convert marginal resources into sustenance and to disseminate know-how across alien psyches generated resilience that algorithms could not simulate. It changed how the council thought about value. Terraforming contracts were reissued with clauses about cultural exchange. Trade privileges were extended to the human cohorts. Other species began funding culinary academies and survival education programs on their worlds. The humans returned to Earth with new dishes, recipes adapted from xenoflora, and a set of tiny recipe cards printed on salvaged polymer. Back on Earth, their stories became legend. Mara founded a school teaching adaptive cuisine, botany, chemistry, and narrative, how to tell a hungry group that food is possible. Lien pushed for field medicine programs. The barista opened a cafe that trained patients in rhythm. They were invited to speak in halls of power and to small, smoky kitchens alike. In corridors and cramped kitchens, there were quieter ripples that never reached policy memos. A Crest child learned to stir a pot without splashing and discovered rhythm as a comfort. An old Gar artisan, who had spent decades perfecting clay patterns, found herself fascinated by how a human pressed leaf and salt into a roast and how that pressure changed texture. Small trade began. A Belu gave a vial of preserved sea gel for roasted seeds. A Crest taught a human to eat a line from kelp fiber. A human showed a Belu how to smoke tubers to preserve them. Techniques moved as stories do. How to build a solar reflector lens. How to ferment safely. How to make a poultice that reduced infection. Those practical folk tales traveled home and nested in communities. They did not erase centuries of rivalry, but they seeded tools people could use when supply lines broke. For many species, that quiet change was a revolution, as soft and steady as steam rising from a shared bowl and unexpected, slow dignity. But the true reward wasn't titles or trade rights. It was a quiet moment when a child in a refugee camp mimicked Mara's peeling rhythm and looked up, eyes wide, at an elder who had been convinced nothing could be done. "We can cook," the child said in a language stitched from 5 tongues. The elder laughed, a sound like spoons clinking. The Crucible had been designed to prune species down to those who could endure. What it had not predicted was that endurance could be taught and that teaching could be weaponized into a craft of care. Humans had arrived with curiosity, tenacity, and a strange domestic art. In a universe that prized power, they traded a saucepan and a lesson, and that was enough.